Ah, the Vertigo piece. Bloody hell. I initially intended to do a scene by scene, possibly you can tell due to the number of screen caps here, though I decided that it would be less interesting than a piece which discusses the entirety of the piece coming together. So I've always enjoyed Brian De Palma's assessment of Vertigo as a film about the act of cinematic manipulation itself, or at least akin to what a filmmaker does of their subjects. Gavin Elster idealizes and molds an image of Madeline entirely unreal, an ideal which is not truly tethered to a tangible individual, and as the viewer observer, obsessed and enchanted by an object which is derived from a recognizable reality, but ultimately an artifice, an illusion, and this completely alters their perception of reality, of desire, of their inherent value as a being, or as a male in this very specific instance, and erodes their perhaps already delicate sanity. To restore his self worth, he must meet his fantasies, moulded by some magician, at some point halfway, identifying a duty to act as our resurrected, realized Madeline, though risking the realization that the apparent composer of the artifice was illuminating objects derived from subjects which could never match those ideals. The storybook, later referred to as Hollywood, illustrations of human love and romance are intoxicating to younger males, and this is often understated in a world wherein the sexual urge is considered the unsubtly submerged motivator behind male pursuit of a partner, although even in the age of available contraceptives, digital pornography, and the looming shadow of banal divorce, the younger male teenagers are, prior to the onset of a poisoning cynicism, enamored of the prospect of an idealized, perhaps objectifying in its own respects, romantic partner, prospective family, and sanitized, blissful, happy ending, happy eternity. See my potentially flawed video on John Ford's The Quiet Man for a discussion on the more understated qualities of a male brain in this respect, often disintegrated by a desire to appease a boorish patriarchal intimidation omnipresent via the others in the pack, yet entirely evident, if not usually dormant. In Hitchcock's Vertigo, the Helen of Troy model in Western art is at its most self-aware and self-analyzing, one of the best texts ever composed about the male condition generally, certainly. We can go on about the superlative photographic sheen from Robert Burks, the sublimity of James Stewart's and Kim Novak's acting, or the creative inspired direction, staging, blocking, and spatial editing schema via Hitchcock himself and with editor George Tomasini in tow. Vertigo is a series of decisions which still intensely beguile film enthusiasts to this very day. The fact that Hitchcock never spoke much about Vertigo, especially in comparison to some of his other well-known features, enhances its mystique immensely. It seemed to potentially infer that the film was enigmatically personal for Hitchcock, a project which, after its vague critical rejection and middling commercial popularity, appeared to upset the author, this reception, so that he might never speak or create anything so personal, so confessional, ever again while he lived. The adoration and fascination around Vertigo culminated in it being considered not only Hitchcock's masterpiece, but to some, according to a now famous 2012 Sight and Sound Critics poll, the greatest film ever made by anyone. And I have to say now, I think Vertigo is both a superior picture and choice to both the Chantal Akerman title, but then that goes without saying, doesn't it? I went over this in an upload on Ackerman's other most famous film, 77's News from Home. We don't form opinions to impress other vapid vermin here on the AOD. But also to, well, Citizen Kane. Whilst Wells demonstrated his genius time and again across his filmography, Lady from Shanghai, Touch of Evil, Mr. Arkad, and Chimes at Midnight, all among the finest films ever from anyone, absolutely, I've often considered Citizen Kane, the more I had viewed his entire body of work, one of the least interesting amongst these. Its place in history is undeniable, its influence in cinematographic innovation, thank you Greg Tolan, and its editing schema, future director Robert Wise, desire praise forevermore. However, is the greatest film ever made some ever so slightly hackneyed diatribe about this American who fulfilled the tragic archetype of being an American in that oh so ever obnoxious and self-obsessed way that Americans have been entirely taken by in their assessments of great American novels, Fitzgerald, Steinbeck, Twain, Faulkner, whom fucking ever. I bloody hope not. As a non-American, I refuse to be held prisoner to this idea that the most acclaimed films or novels are American trite about these American Americans, and so I could never, for this reason alone, consider Kane the greatest picture ever made. See the Citizen Kane upload for more info, if ever so inclined. And I am an enormous fan of Citizen Kane, that being said. But I'm such a fan of Wells that I think his other work, I think he improved upon it in almost every subsequent film, including Anderson's, right there, you know. And I say, Vertigo, on the other hand, I viewed at the same age as I did Kane, a 12-year-old freshly experiencing this rite known as high school, and it really did a number on the much younger AOD. Kane was impressive too, certainly. Many films were that I viewed around that time. Lawrence of Arabia, The Shining, On the Waterfront, even other Hitchcock films such as Rear Window, North by Northwest, and Psycho. Something was mystifying about Vertigo, though, the way it unfolds from a more traditional grounded drama mystery into a picture which feels, oozes, an ethereal aura, unveils a completely unforeseen twist, but then becomes more compelling as a film about how the victimized, duped protagonist reacts to these challenging, sensational, extreme events. As he drags her up to the clock tower, the peak of the building, he demands to have his sense of self back. He demands she admit her complicity in the plot. He wants to know if he ever truly loved her. He wants to find out if he can ever truly believe her about anything, let alone where her claims of her love are concerned. The plot synopsis is often described Judy as acting scared at the nun and running frightened to her accidental falling to her death. I think it at least is equally plausible that she runs deliberately to her death the moment Scotty loosened his grip on her. I don't think she would have done this because she was scared Scotty would hurt her, or because he would try to expose the plot, or because he wanted to hold it against her afterward, but because she felt as though Scotty would never truly love her. I'm not sure if he could have. She was not Madeline, the one he felt he knew. Even if she physically played the part, and she never could be, no one could be. He doesn't know how to react except with shock and when she dies, and neither do we. The critical consensus still doesn't know how to adequately or appropriately react to that final moment in Vertigo, but he appears less mortified than he had with the initial Madeline's death. In a morbid way, he is already over it because he knows that she never existed, and he did not love Judy Barton, the woman who just died. I believe Judy really did love Scotty, or her internal monologue said as much. She was probably wrapped up in Scotty's mystification of her, as she perhaps knew she might never experience such a gaze upon her otherwise. What woman could expect something like that? Scotty's obsession did not ever exist. Hitchcock intended to remove the scene where Judy reveals to the audience that she was Madeline, which casts some fascinating doubt on how truly genius an author might be, perhaps just superficially, as almost certainly the film would be less interesting without this, whilst it would still be intensely filmic a conclusion, us only finding out about the deception truly via the necklace and the confirmation at the end. But this makes Judy Barton much less interesting as a character, and the tragedy becomes much more so once it is revealed she genuinely did love Scotty. I feel as though Vertigo has received an unnecessary backlash from the more self-doubting of the film world. It is not the critical consensus it is not confident in. It is yourselves. It is you who have been trained to believe that any supposed error in Vertigo is an error. It is not the consensus. It is you who are wrong. No, seriously, it was adored due to it being considered underappreciated at one time. No one knew what to expect, except that it wasn't historically, by the 80s, when it was first apparently reevaluated, considered a major Hitchcock classic, and so its reputation soared, to the point where it can needlessly disappoint some younger film rodents now, sadly. I'll always be in the Vertigo might be the greatest film ever made camp. That's our stance here at AOD. If you disagree, feel free to unsubscribe. If Vertigo were considered lesser Hitchcock, it would still be my favourite, and I might even be tempted to call it the best film ever made, even if this consensus didn't exist much in the first. One of the most rewatchable, perhaps this is what intrinsically makes it the greatest film ever in some fans' minds, captivating and mysterious films of all time, Vertigo is the beginning of the unreal, slightly surreal, expressionistic narrative thriller, ambiguous endings, food for FAQ sections on IMDb. Check the old Fear X review on the Stories of the Voyage channel with Noel Oakeshott for some elaboration on this, and the inspiration for much experimentation in the medium going forward. One detects influences upon Antonioni, perhaps even Goddard, on David Lynch and upon Ridley Scott, maybe even Cronenberg or Gilliam. The bending of reality into something fantastical, dreamlike, expressionistic, much of it is rooted in Hitchcock's Vertigo, or so it appears. You could also cite Wells' Lady from Shanghai, or maybe a bit less explicitly or directly mimicked, or, When Ra's Woman on the Beach, or Dwayne's Most Dangerous Man Alive, also, well, no one saw that, or very few did. Where on the Vertigo bus here on AOD, you ought not to have expected anything different. Ain't trying to upend any pre-existing status quo here. If the adulation of Vertigo counts as such, at one time, just over 10 years ago, it was perhaps the opposite, although that's my preferred era of establishment subverting when I was a bit younger. Naturally, I feel this way, and Vertigo will always be close to my heart. Few films make me feel so depressively self-aware, self-conscious, and self-fulfilled for devoting so much time to films. When the experiences are so strong, intense, vivid, and passionate as those derived from Hitchcock's Vertigo, I feel very little regrets at all in whatever choices I've made up to that point prior to the viewing itself. Because when I am watching Vertigo, all feels right, manicured, and decided, as though some deity is moulding my own perception of reality to suit my emotional desires, expectations, and omnipresent dreams.